In 1952, the Central Intelligence Agency began paying a personal subsidy to a Greek army colonel named Georgios Papadopoulos. 15 years later, he used tanks to end Greek democracy in a single night. This is not a story about a secret coup. Everything about it is documented. The warnings, the plan, the men who carried it out, and the 7 years that followed. What is buried is not the fact of it. What is buried is how ordinary it was allowed to become. By the spring of 1967, Greece had spent 2 years lurching between unstable coalition governments. King Constantine II had forced out the elected prime minister, Georgios Papadopoulos, in 1965. The country was scheduled to hold new elections on the 28th of May, 1967. Most observers expected the Center Union Party to win comfortably. The election never happened. American intelligence had been watching a group of mid-ranking army officers for more than a year. A declassified field report dated the 7th of March, 1966, carried the title, Rightist Greek Military Conspiratorial Group. It named the officers planning to suspend democracy. It named Georgios Papadopoulos directly. The report sat in American files for 14 months, while nothing was done to stop what it described. There were, in fact, 2 coup plots moving in parallel that spring. Senior generals, loyal to the king, were preparing their own plan to prevent a Center Union election victory. A smaller group of colonels, led by Papadopoulos, decided not to wait for permission. On the night of the 20th of April, they moved first. At 2 o'clock in the morning on the 21st of April, 1967, tanks rolled out of the armored training center on the edge of Athens. They seized Parliament. They seized the national broadcaster. They seized the telephone exchange and the royal palace. Colonel Yaros and Leros led units through the city, arresting politicians while they slept. At dawn, a single sentence went out over Greek radio. The Hellenic armed forces undertake the governance of the country. Nothing more was explained. Nothing more needed to be. The arrests that followed were not chaotic. They were methodical. A list of 10,000 names had already been prepared in advance, drawn from years of surveillance on the Greek left. Politicians, journalists, trade unionists, academics, and ordinary citizens with no public profile at all were taken from their homes before most of Athens had finished breakfast. Among them was the composer Mikis Theodorakis, already internationally known, whose music was about to become illegal to play, sell, or even be caught listening to. The Junta suspended 11 articles of the Greek constitution in a single stroke. Freedom of the press ended. Freedom of assembly ended. Special military courts were created to try civilians for political crimes that had not existed the day before. The operation that made all of this possible had a code name, Prometheus. It was not invented for the coup. Prometheus was a NATO contingency plan, drafted years earlier, meant to help Greek forces respond if Soviet troops ever crossed the border. The colonels used a plan built to defend the country against an outside enemy, to seize it from the inside. By sunrise, elections scheduled for 5 weeks later no longer mattered. The men who did this were not generals. Papadopoulos was a lieutenant colonel. Stylianos Patakos was a brigadier general. Nikolaos Makaresos was a colonel. 3 officers among 5 conspirators seized an entire country in under 6 hours. King Constantine went along with it at first. He administered the oath of office to a puppet prime minister, rather than risk open conflict with the tanks already in the streets. American diplomats received him privately in the days that followed. He described the plotters, in his own words, as incredibly stupid, ultra-right-wing men who had brought disaster to his country. He said this while still allowing them to govern in his name. Washington's response was cautious in public and permissive in private. An arms embargo was announced. The Pentagon quietly evaded it, continuing military shipments to a government that had just abolished its own parliament. A junta that had come to power partly with American foreknowledge now continued to receive American weapons, while that same foreknowledge remained classified. In December of 1967, the king tried to reverse what he had allowed. He flew to northern Greece and attempted to rally loyal army units against the junta. The counter-coup collapsed within a day. Constantine fled to Rome. He would not set foot in Greece again as a reigning monarch. What life looked like inside Greece over the next several years was smaller and stranger than the language of politics usually allows. Miniskirts were banned. Long hair on men was banned. Certain classical Greek plays were prohibited from performance. An official index of forbidden books, songs, and films was maintained and updated. Ordinary daily choices: what to wear, what to listen to, what to read, became matters the state claimed the right to police. Of the roughly 6,000 political prisoners held on the island of Yaros, more than half eventually signed a formal pledge renouncing communism in exchange for release. The remaining prisoners, who refused, were transferred to a second camp on the island of Leros, where they waited for a collapse that would not arrive for years. Mikis Theodorakis went into hiding after the coup. A military court sentenced him in absentia. Months later, he was captured, jailed, and eventually banished with his wife and children to a remote mountain village for 3 years. Composers, playwrights, and musicians internationally added their names to petitions for his release. It made no difference to the junta's calendar. What followed inside Greece has its own buried record, kept in a building at 18 Bouboulinas Street in Athens. This was the headquarters of the military police, an organization known by its Greek initials as ESA. Ordinary citizens, students, and suspected leftists were taken there for interrogation. Survivors later testified to beatings, to a torture method known as phalanga, to psychological abuse designed to break a person without leaving marks that could easily be photographed. By the end of 1967, governments in Scandinavia and the Netherlands had gathered enough testimony to file a formal complaint against Greece with the European Commission of Human Rights. Investigators spent nearly 2 years compiling evidence directly from survivors, at real personal risk to everyone who agreed to speak. In 1969, the Commission concluded that Greece had violated the European Convention on Human Rights, specifically citing the use of torture. Rather than accept suspension, the junta withdrew from the Council of Europe entirely. It was the first time a member state had ever left the organization to avoid facing the consequences of what its own government had done to its own people. The junta held power for 7 years. It finally collapsed in July of 1974, after a botched attempt to overthrow the president of Cyprus triggered a Turkish invasion of the island. The colonels, who had promised strength and stability, could not survive the crisis they had caused. Konstantinos Karamanlis returned from exile in Paris to restore civilian government. The following year, Papadopoulos, Patakos, and Makarezos stood trial for high treason in a proceeding the international press called Greece's Nuremberg. All 3 were sentenced to death. The new Karamanlis government commuted every sentence to life imprisonment. This is the buried record of 1967. Not a secret, but a sequence of decisions that were each individually documented and collectively ignored until tanks were already in the street. A financial relationship in 1952. A warning report in 1966. An embargo evaded in plain sight. None of it hidden. All of it simply not acted upon. This same Greece, 20 years earlier, had fought a civil war explicitly to keep a communist government out of Athens. That war produced its own casualties that this channel has already documented in the story of the Detsa Behgaltsi, the 28,000 children evacuated from villages in northern Greece and never allowed to return home. That first episode is the file this channel opened. This episode is what happened to the country they were taken from, when the same fear that displaced them was used 2 decades later to suspend democracy itself. Different decade, same justification, a different kind of file, closed on an entire nation rather than on individual children, but closed by the same logic. A government decided that the risk of communism justified removing people from their homes in 1948. A different set of officers decided the same risk justified removing an entire country's constitution in 1967. Neither decision required a hidden conspiracy. Both were carried out in daylight with paperwork by men whose names are fully known. The file on 1967 is not sealed. Most of it has been declassified for years. It simply asks more of the reader than most people are willing to give. This is the buried record. Subscribe to follow the archive. The next file is already open.